You see, being an imager of God is not something you do. It is something you are. It is not a work you attain. It is a calling you get to embrace. It is not something that you have to work to perfect. It is what you were perfectly created to be. Welcome back to the Reconstructed Church and Colossians Part 5. Today we are going to begin to take a look at who this perfect image bearer of God is and why he is extremely valuable for you to get to know. We're going to be in Colossians chapter 1, verses 15 to 20 today, if you would like to follow along. And remember, we are not going to look at every word in Colossians, but we are walking through this letter and focusing on three major concepts. First, we are looking to find our real identities as creations of God and as members of his faith family. Second, we're looking at who God's real identity is and how this understanding changes everything about us. And in the first few lessons, we learned that God has always existed. He simply is. But at some point in history, he decided to create a spiritual family. And so he created Elohim, or spirit beings, and they have rank and titles and order, just like in theory, we should have rank and titles and order in our earthly or natural world. But God didn't stop with the supernatural family. He decided to create a human family too, earth dwellers, who would be placed in the garden or a location where they would be able to interact with both their God and their supernatural family. Both categories of these beings were or are imagers or image bearers of their creator Yahweh, the creator God. The lesser Elohim would image God in the supernatural realm, and the humans, both male and female, would image God in the earthly realm, or what we would call the natural realm. I don't really like that term, but it's the most common way that we talk about our world today, to call it the natural world. You see, humans are like porpoises. We were made for two worlds. We breathe the air of this natural or earthly world, but if we are not swimming in the waters of the supernatural, we are suffocating ourselves and not really living at all. And in Colossians 1:15, we are introduced to the perfect imager of God, one who is similar to both God's supernatural and human families, but also very different. We have come to know this one as Jesus, the second person of the Godhead, or Yeshua, Jesus, Joshua, the Christ, or the Anointed One, the Messiah. But before we try to grasp what it means for him to be the perfect imager of God, we need to get an understanding of what it means to be an imager, or created in the image of God, the Imago Dei. So let's go ahead and read Colossians 1, verses 15 through 20, and I'll be reading in the ESV. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him, and he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. Okay, so we just read that this Jesus person is the image of the invisible God, where all of the fullness of the Godhead was pleased to dwell. But what the heck does that mean? Christianity is simple, they said. Just believe. No, it's actually complex at times. So let's break this down and see if we could bring some clarity to the idea of what it means to be an image bearer of God. Now, we first get introduced to this idea of image bearing in Genesis 1, and it goes like this. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. Now, a couple of things you may have missed in those verses if you're not careful. First, remember back in lesson 2, we discussed the us here. The us here in Genesis 1:26 is referenced in Psalm 82, and it's referring to God's divine counsel, the sons of God, or the holy ones referred to in the Old Testament. And because God includes his counsel in the statement, "Let us make man in our image," this tells us that his supernatural family is also created in the image of God. Now, I know that many of us have been taught that humans are the only image bearers of God, that we are unique among his creation. And in part, that is true. We are unique among God's creation because we were made for these two realms. But we are not the only image bearers. We are not. God has supernatural image bearers in the spiritual realm, and he has us humans on earth as his image bearers. And Genesis 1:26 and 27 is very clear on this point once you see it. But this still doesn't answer the question of what it means to be an image bearer. Likely, the most common way that scholars have tried to express what it means to be an image bearer of God is to connect this concept with physical attributes. So many of them say God can think, and God can communicate, and God can create with his hands. And therefore, imaging God means that we also can think, can communicate, and can create. Or they say something like, since God created us special, we have dignity, value, and worth. Now let's think about that for a minute and process to see if that concept works with this idea. Does God's supernatural family have the ability to create, communicate, and think? Well, yes, they can. And we see this clearly in Genesis chapter 3, where the serpent, one of God's supernatural created beings, chose to willfully rebel, communicated this rebellion to Adam and Eve, and then created chaos and death in this world. And if you have never understood this idea before, it could be mind-blowing for you. I mean, think about it. The supernatural world is full of beings, some loyal to Yahweh and some in direct rebellion to him and his plans. And they are actively creating ways to thwart God's plan, and they communicate lies everywhere. Okay, so the idea of being image bearers of God, being connected to attributes like communication or creating or thinking, does work with the supernatural world. But does it work with the natural world too? Now, in part, yes, it does, because humans can also think and communicate and create, and we are just as good as our supernatural family at rebelling and causing chaos too. But being an image bearer of God cannot simply mean having these attributes. It can't. Why do you ask? Well, because in our earthly realm or natural realm, animals can do all three of these activities too. I mean, ask yourself, does your little dog think? Yeah, it does. Can a dolphin or a honeybee communicate? Yes, they can. And can animals build or create? I mean, have you ever seen an ant farm? I think ants can create more successful communities than humans will ever be able to. And yet the Bible never indicates that an animal or an insect is created in the image of God, because being created in the image of God has nothing to do with our attributes. I mean, think about it this way. In Exodus, God says that he creates or allows to be created the blind, the lame, and the mute. And if attributes like communication and cognitive abilities were what God had in mind when he said that humans are created in his image, then God created an unjust class system simply connected to our DNA. And God is not unjust. I mean, think about it. God judges our hearts, not our outward abilities. And I have autistic friends and friends with deep physical ailments, and they image God better than you or I may ever will with our working limbs, our processing brains, and our mouths that communicate. They have no less dignity, value, or worth because their physical bodies have limitations on this side of heaven. I mean, just think about this concept in the abortion debate. If being an image bearer of God is connected to our attributes, then why would a baby in a womb have any value unless it were birthed? You see, this idea of the imago Dei, or being created in God's image, or being an imager of God, is very important for us to ponder and theorize about, because it has so many implications to our lives. And if the idea of being an image bearer of God is not connected to our attributes, then what does it mean to image God? I think 2 Corinthians 5 gives us a clue. And so let's read verses 20 and 21 and then pull all this together. 2 Corinthians 5 verses 20 and 21 say, "Therefore, we are ambassadors for Christ, God making his appeal through us. We implore you, on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God. For our sake, he made him to be sin, who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God." That word ambassador gives us a big clue into what it means to be created in the image of God, or as an imager of God. You see, being an imager of God is not something you do. It is something you are. It is not a work you attain. It is a calling you get to embrace. It is not something that you have to work to perfect. It is what you were perfectly created to be. Being an image bearer of God is being his representation in his absence. It is being his ambassador while he is away. So let's look through what an ambassador does and see if this helps us with this concept. You've likely never heard of Elizabeth Frawley Bagley, but she is the current U.S. ambassador to Brazil. As an ambassador, it is her role to represent the U.S. and our interests in Brazil. If she does a good job, then she will use her communication skills, her creative abilities, and her thoughts to focus on ways to be a reflection of or an image of our country's interests to her region. An ambassador is not trying to implement his or her own agenda, but is instead content to fill the role of her leader, or in our case, to fulfill the good works which God has prepared beforehand for us to walk in them. In other words, being an imager of God is to embrace your God-given role as an ambassador of God, to fellowship with him, to learn your purpose for being created, and then to enjoy fulfilling that role alongside your other family members in God's house. Predominantly, that role is what we read in 2 Corinthians 5, to implore other image bearers who may still be distant from their Creator to be reconciled back to him so they too can image him well. An imager is a representation or a reflection of God, an ambassador. And that brings us back to Colossians 1:15, where we end today, with this question. If God has imagers in his supernatural world, and God has imagers in his human or natural world, what makes this beloved Son, Jesus, different than both? For in Colossians 1:15, again, we read, he, Jesus, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. You see, God creates because he is a creator. He creates families because he is love and wants to have a family with him. It is not that he needed us as a form of self-validation. He wanted us. He wants you, and that is so much more special when we consider it. And he created his family members to represent him all throughout creation. In creating them in his image, he also gifted them with what scholars call communicable attributes like creativity and free will and desires. However, being God and sovereign, he also knew that they would fall in their task to image him, that they would be corrupted in this world, and that they would need someone to rescue them. And since no human or spiritual being could perfectly image the uncreated one, he, God, put on flesh, incarnated into a human baby, and lived as the perfect imager of God. As Colossians 1:15 says, he is the firstborn over all creation. And this does not mean that he himself was created. It is not describing creation, but order. Firstborn here in the sense of preeminence, or he's the head. He's over it all, ordering it all. It's not chronology here. And we're going to get to more of this next week, but this is very important. We have to understand the terminology in Scripture and to grasp it in the way that the original audience and the original author intended. And him using this terminology of firstborn here is not describing a creative act. It's describing a position as the one true ambassador for God. I mean, think about it this way. God created a family to image him, knowing that this family would one day need a rescuer, knowing that this role could only be met by himself. God humbled himself and was born to a virgin woman where he could perfectly represent God himself on earth, culminating in the representation of God's perfect sacrifice to reconcile his lost earthly imagers back to himself, thus freeing us once bound by sin, imagers of God, to be the ambassadors of reconciliation for him, to invite our other lost family members back into the fold. Being imagers of God means that we get the best job on this planet. It means that we get to help other lost imagers find their way back to the one they were created to image in the first place. Now, just imagine how much better our world would be if we could get our eyes off of the chaos of this world and onto the one imager, the perfect ambassador who died to bring us peace, who died to reconcile the lost imagers of God back into his family. Now, next week, we're going to take a look at creation and what it actually means to be created ex nihilo, or out of nothing. And here's a hint. You will not find that in Genesis chapter 1. We get that concept from here in Colossians. We will see you soon.